It began with a bright orange envelope taped to the windshield of Michael Hartley's silver sedan, the kind of fluorescent warning that could be seen from down the block. It fluttered in the breeze like a flag of humiliation, catching the attention of neighbors who pretended not to stare as they collected their morning newspapers. Michael had returned home late the previous night after a long shift at the hospital, too exhausted to care about the HOA's endless rules. The small cul-de-sac was quiet, his car neatly parked by the curb outside his own house. But apparently, that was enough to trigger the wrath of the Homeowners Association. Inside the envelope was a $250 fine for unauthorized street parking. The letter, printed in bold serif font, cited Article 8, Section 3 of the Community Bylaws. Residents must not leave vehicles on the public street overnight. A warning followed. Repeat offenses could result in escalating fines or even legal action. Michael couldn't believe it. Every other house on the street had cars parked in driveways too small for their growing families. Visitors and contractors parked on the street all the time, but it seemed the HOA had singled them out. He sighed, staring at the citation as the morning sun rose over the manicured lawns. It wasn't about parking, it was about power. The HOA president, Deborah Keene, had been running the neighborhood board for almost a decade. She lived 3 doors down, in a house that looked like it had leapt off the pages of a suburban catalog. Trimmed hedges, symmetrical flower beds, and a flagpole out front with a crisp American flag. Deborah had a reputation: stern, controlling, and obsessed with maintaining neighborhood aesthetics. She carried a clipboard like a badge and enforced the HOA rules with military precision. Michael had only crossed paths with her once, when she came to remind him about his recycling bin being left out past 7 p.m. Her voice was sweet but sharp, and her smile never reached her eyes. It was clear from that day Deborah didn't like him. At first, Michael thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she hadn't realized he was parked there just for the night. He sent an email to the HOA board explaining his long work hours and asking for leniency. The response came 2 days later, a cold, one-sentence note from the HOA secretary. Per HOA policy, all fines must be paid in full before any appeals can be considered. No explanation, no compromise. Just bureaucracy. So Michael paid. It wasn't worth the hassle to fight them. At least, not yet. But over the next few weeks, things got worse. The HOA started watching him more closely. A warning arrived for improper lawn maintenance after a single patch of brown grass appeared during a heat wave. Another fine followed for unapproved decorative lighting, a string of solar path lights he'd bought on sale. The petty harassment felt deliberate, almost personal. Then came his second parking fine. It happened after his driveway was blocked one evening by a delivery truck unloading new furniture for the neighbors across the street. Michael had no choice but to leave his car on the curb for a few hours. By morning, there was again another orange envelope. This time, the fine was doubled. He could feel the anger building inside him. It wasn't just about money. It was the principle of it. Deborah and her little HOA army were flexing their authority, trying to remind him that he didn't belong. But Michael wasn't the type to bow quietly. He began researching the HOA bylaws late at night, scrolling through the digital PDF on his laptop. The rules were dense, full of legal jargon and vague clauses. But one thing stood out. The HOA's jurisdiction applied to common areas, shared facilities, and external appearances of residential properties. There was no specific mention of what homeowners could do within their own yards, as long as it didn't impede safety or alter community drainage systems. A small loophole, barely noticeable, but it sparked an idea. If they didn't want him parking on the street, maybe he didn't have to. Maybe he could bring the parking to him. The next morning, he stood on his front porch, coffee in hand, surveying the patch of grass that stretched between his driveway and the sidewalk. It was narrow but long, enough space for a car. The wheels in his mind began turning. He imagined replacing the grass with gravel or concrete, extending his driveway right up to the edge of his property line. It would technically be private property, completely within his rights. And if it just happened to resemble a second parking space, well, that was nobody's business but his own. Michael smiled for the first time in weeks. He spent the next few days quietly planning. He measured the space, checked local zoning codes, and even called the county office to verify property boundaries. Everything lined up perfectly. No permits required for minor landscaping changes. No HOA rule explicitly forbidding driveway extensions. Still, he knew he had to play it carefully. Deborah had eyes everywhere. HOA members walked the streets daily, clipboard in hand, noting any potential violations. So Michael decided to bide his time. He paid the second fine, reluctantly, but said nothing. He wanted them to think he'd accepted defeat. Meanwhile, he began ordering supplies under the radar. Paving stones, gravel, edging materials, and a few decorative shrubs to make it all look landscaped. The deliveries arrived gradually, spaced out to avoid suspicion. Each weekend, he worked quietly in the early mornings, digging, leveling, and laying down the foundation. To anyone passing by, it looked like simple yard maintenance. But to Michael, it was the blueprint for poetic justice. By the end of the month, his front yard no longer looked like a typical suburban lawn. It was sleek, clean, and practical, a private driveway extension disguised as a home improvement project. He parked his car on it for the first time one Friday evening. The engine shut off with a satisfying click. He sat there for a moment, staring at the HOA president's house down the street. The porch light was on. He could almost feel her watching from behind the curtains. The next morning, the HOA patrol came by, as expected. Clipboards in hand, they lingered near his property, pointing and whispering. Michael simply waved, smiling politely. The following Monday, a letter arrived, not a fine, but a notice of inquiry demanding an explanation for unauthorized yard modifications. Michael laughed out loud. He had anticipated it perfectly. He opened his laptop and began typing a response, citing every rule, regulation, and legal clause he'd researched. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, satisfied. This time, he wasn't just defending himself. He was fighting back, and Deborah Keene had no idea what was coming next. Per HOA policy, all fines must be paid in full before any appeals can be considered. No explanation, no compromise, just bureaucracy. So Michael paid. It wasn't worth the hassle to fight them, at least not yet. But over the next few weeks, things got worse. The HOA started watching him more closely. A warning arrived for improper lawn maintenance after a single patch of brown grass appeared during a heat wave. Another fine followed for unapproved decorative lighting, a string of solar path lights he'd bought on sale. The petty harassment felt deliberate, almost personal. Then came the second parking fine. It happened after his driveway was blocked one evening by a delivery truck unloading new furniture for the neighbors across the street. Michael had no choice but to leave his car on the curb for a few hours. By morning, there it was again, another orange envelope. This time, the fine was doubled. He could feel the anger building inside him. It wasn't just about money. It was the principle of it. Deborah and her little HOA army were flexing their authority, trying to remind him that he didn't belong. But Michael wasn't the type to bow quietly. He began researching the HOA bylaws late at night, scrolling through the digital PDF on his laptop. The rules were dense, full of legal jargon and vague clauses. But one thing stood out. The HOA's jurisdiction applied to common areas, shared facilities, and external appearances of residential properties. There was no specific mention of what homeowners could do within their own yards, as long as it didn't impede safety or alter community drainage systems. A small loophole, barely noticeable, but it sparked an idea. If they didn't want him parking on the street, maybe he didn't have to. Maybe he could bring the parking to him. The next morning, he stood on his front porch, coffee in hand, surveying the patch of grass that stretched between his driveway and the sidewalk. It was narrow but long, enough space for a car. The wheels in his mind began turning. He imagined replacing the grass with gravel or concrete, extending his driveway right up to the edge of his property line. It would technically be private property, completely within his rights. And if it just happened to resemble a second parking space, well, that was nobody's business but his own. Michael smiled for the first time in weeks. He spent the next few days quietly planning. He measured the space, checked local zoning codes, and even called the county office to verify property boundaries. Everything lined up perfectly. No permits required for minor landscaping changes. No HOA rule explicitly forbidding driveway extensions. Still, he knew he had to play it carefully. Deborah had eyes everywhere. HOA members walked the streets daily, clipboard in hand, noting any potential violations. So Michael decided to bide his time. He paid the second fine, reluctantly, but said nothing. He wanted them to think he'd accepted defeat. Meanwhile, he began ordering supplies under the radar: paving stones, gravel, edging materials, and a few decorative shrubs to make it all look landscaped. The deliveries arrived gradually, spaced out to avoid suspicion. Each weekend, he worked quietly in the early mornings, digging, leveling, and laying down the foundation. To anyone passing by, it looked like simple yard maintenance. But to Michael, it was the blueprint for poetic justice. By the end of the month, his front yard no longer looked like a typical suburban lawn. It was sleek, clean, and practical, a private driveway extension disguised as a home improvement project. He parked his car on it for the first time one Friday evening. The engine shut off with a satisfying click. He sat there for a moment, staring at the HOA president's house down the street. The porch light was on. He could almost feel her watching from behind the curtains. The next morning, the HOA patrol came by, as expected. Clipboards in hand, they lingered near his property, pointing and whispering. Michael simply waved, smiling politely. The following Monday, a letter arrived. Not a fine, but a notice of inquiry demanding an explanation for unauthorized yard modifications. Michael laughed out loud. He had anticipated it perfectly. He opened his laptop and began typing a response, citing every rule, regulation, and legal clause he'd researched. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, satisfied. This time, he wasn't just defending himself. He was fighting back. And Deborah Keene had no idea what was coming next. Neighbors had begun to peek out from behind curtains and porch windows. A few even stood under umbrellas at the end of the cul-de-sac, whispering among themselves. The spectacle had drawn them out. HOA drama was the neighborhood's favorite entertainment. For several long minutes, nobody moved. Rain pattered against the gravel. Deborah's pen tapped against her clipboard in irritation. Finally, Michael spoke, just a few measured words that broke the silence. He didn't shout, didn't argue, but the calm finality in his tone made it clear he wasn't moving. Deborah's composure cracked for the first time. Her jaw tightened, and she turned sharply toward the contractors, snapping at them to pause the work until further notice. They began packing up their tools, moving slower than before, avoiding eye contact with either of them. As the truck pulled away, Deborah stayed behind. She glared at Michael for a long, tense moment, rain streaking across her umbrella like veins of silver, then turned and walked briskly back to her car. The standoff was over, but the war had just escalated. Michael went back inside, drenched but victorious. His driveway extension was intact, but his peace of mind was gone. He knew Deborah would never let this go. That evening, he received another email, this one marked urgent. Immediate action required. It accused him of obstructing authorized maintenance work and warned that the HOA would be contacting county enforcement for noncompliance. Michael laughed bitterly. She was bluffing. County enforcement wouldn't touch private property without a formal complaint or court order, and he had both the property deed and the attorney's letter on his side. Still, he knew she wouldn't stop there. Deborah had lost control of the narrative, and that was her greatest fear. He could imagine her calling emergency meetings, spinning the story to make him the villain, a hostile homeowner endangering the neighborhood. So, he decided to get ahead of her. That night, Michael posted a detailed message on the neighborhood's community forum, polite, factual, and accompanied by photos of his yard before, during, and after the project. He explained how every step had followed local laws and that the HOA's attempts to tear it down were unauthorized. He didn't name Deborah directly, but everyone knew who was behind it. By morning, the post had exploded. Dozens of residents chimed in, some supporting him, others nervously siding with the HOA. But the most surprising responses came from people who had their own horror stories. Unfair fines, denied approvals, and petty harassment from Deborah's board. The tide was turning. Deborah tried to delete his post, but the moderators, tired of her overreach, refused. For the first time in years, her control over the community narrative began to slip. That same week, the county inspector actually showed up, but not for the reason Deborah had hoped. Michael had filed a preemptive inquiry, inviting the inspector to confirm that his landscaping was fully compliant. The visit was brief. The inspector examined the gravel, measured the property line, and left satisfied. His report arrived a few days later. No violations. Property modifications within private boundary and local code. Michael printed out a copy and taped it inside his front window, facing the street. Anyone walking by could see it clearly. It was his badge of victory and a quiet, public humiliation for Deborah. But Deborah was nothing if not persistent. She pivoted her strategy once again. Instead of targeting Michael directly, she began enforcing obscure rules across the entire neighborhood. Mailbox height, fence color, lawn ornament limits. It was chaos. Homeowners who had ignored her for years suddenly found themselves fined for trivial things. She claimed it was about restoring standards, but everyone knew what it really was: retaliation. The tension in the community grew thicker by the day. People whispered in grocery aisles, shared angry messages online, and began calling for new leadership. One resident even suggested holding a vote to remove Deborah as HOA president. It was something that had never been attempted before, a full-blown recall. Michael stayed quiet through it all. He didn't organize, didn't campaign. He didn't have to. His driveway had become a symbol, proof that the HOA's power could be challenged. Then, one stormy Friday evening, an envelope appeared on his porch. No postage, no name, just the HOA's seal stamped in red. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "Notice of legal action. The HOA board has retained counsel to pursue remedies for ongoing noncompliance." The gloves were off. Deborah was taking him to court. Michael leaned back in his chair, staring at the paper. The rain outside hammered against the window like an echo of his pulse. He wasn't afraid, just tired but resolved. This wasn't just about a parking space anymore. It was about principle, pride, and standing up to a system that thrived on intimidation. He glanced out the window one last time, watching the streetlights flicker through the rain. Round one had gone to him. Round two would be fought in the courtroom, and he was ready. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper and old wood polish, a quiet, sterile place where power shifted not through shouting, but through precision. The air carried a tension so fine it could have been strung between the fluorescent lights and the people sitting beneath them. Michael sat at the defendant's table, composed but alert. Across the aisle sat Deborah Keene, dressed in an immaculate navy suit, her hair pulled into a perfect bun, her ever-present clipboard replaced by a slim leather folder. Around her sat two members of the HOA board, looking equally self-assured, as though victory had already been promised. For Deborah, this was supposed to be her final move, the moment she reasserted her control and humiliated the man who had defied her authority. But for Michael, this was something entirely different. It was vindication. The HOA's complaint accused him of unauthorized structural modification, violation of neighborhood covenants, and failure to comply with HOA restoration directives. The documents were thick, full of legal jargon and exaggerated claims, the kind of paperwork designed to intimidate rather than persuade. But Michael had come prepared. His attorney, a calm, methodical man named Mr. Klein, had built his case like a fortress. Every piece of evidence was neatly organized. Photographs, property maps, city codes, even video recordings of Deborah's unauthorized contractor visit in the rain. Every file told the same story, that Michael's project was legal, his property was private, and the HOA had grossly overstepped its authority. As the proceedings began, the HOA's lawyer launched into an opening statement about community harmony and collective standards. The words sounded polished, but hollow. The lawyer painted Michael as a disruptive resident who ignored due process and defied community regulations. Deborah sat motionless, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. She didn't look at Michael once. When it was their turn, Mr. Klein's voice was steady, deliberate. He didn't dramatize or embellish. Instead, he spoke in simple, Factual terms. The HOA had no jurisdiction over private landscaping. The project followed county codes, and the so-called unauthorized work order had no legal foundation. He presented the inspector's official report, the one that clearly stated no violations found. He followed it with a copy of the HOA's own bylaws, highlighting Section 5.1, the clause that limited their authority to shared and visible structures, not private property. The judge, an older woman with silver-framed glasses, listened carefully. She asked few questions but took copious notes. Every now and then, she glanced over at Deborah, who grew visibly tense as the facts piled against her. Then came the turning point. Mr. Klein played the video, the footage of Deborah's contractors arriving uninvited and attempting to tear up Michael's yard without consent. The rain blurred parts of the image, but the scene was clear enough. Deborah standing under her umbrella, clipboard in hand, overseeing the unauthorized attempt to destroy private property. The courtroom fell silent, except for the faint hum of the video's background rain. When it ended, Deborah's lawyer tried to object, claiming the footage lacked context. But the damage was done. The judge's expression had shifted from neutral to quietly incredulous. Next, Mr. Klein presented something even more devastating. A series of screenshots from the community forum showing Deborah's posts and messages attempting to discredit Michael publicly, calling him a neighborhood disruption and hinting that his project might cause flooding. Defamation, harassment, overreach, the pattern was undeniable. By the time Michael's side rested, Deborah's once confident posture had started to unravel. Her fingers drummed against the folder in her lap. Her lawyer whispered hurriedly, but her expression remained frozen. When her turn came, Deborah took the stand. Her tone was composed but brittle. She spoke about protecting the integrity of the community and upholding standards that everyone had agreed to follow. But under cross-examination, her precision cracked. Mr. Klein asked her a simple question. Can you point to the specific section of the HOA bylaws that prohibits what Mr. Hartley did? Deborah hesitated. She flipped through her folder, scanning pages, avoiding eye contact. Finally, she muttered something about interpretation of visual uniformity. Mr. Klein pressed on. Interpretation is not authority. You agree the bylaws do not explicitly grant you power over personal landscaping modifications within private property boundaries. She tried to pivot, claiming the gravel driveway altered the community aesthetic, but every argument circled back to opinion, not law. The more she spoke, the weaker her position became. By the time the judge called for closing statements, the mood in the courtroom had shifted completely. What began as an HOA crusade now looked like a petty vendetta. Mr. Klein concluded calmly. This case is not about aesthetics. It's about boundaries, legal and personal. The HOA crossed both. The judge recessed briefly before returning with her decision. Her ruling was firm but measured. The HOA's complaint was dismissed. Michael's modifications were deemed fully compliant with both local law and the HOA's own charter. Furthermore, the judge noted that the HOA's attempt to perform unauthorized work on private property constituted an overreach of authority. Then came the final blow. The HOA was ordered to cover Michael's legal fees and issue a written apology for the disruption and harassment caused. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The sound echoed like thunder through the courtroom. Deborah sat motionless, her face pale, lips pressed tight. She didn't look at anyone as she gathered her papers and left. For the first time in years, she was leaving a room not as the most powerful person in it, but as someone defeated, publicly and officially. Michael exhaled slowly. It was over, or at least the legal part was. Outside the courthouse, the sun had broken through the clouds. The rain was gone, leaving the pavement glistening. A few neighbors who had come to watch the hearing congratulated him quietly. Others simply nodded in respect. Word spread quickly back in the neighborhood. By that evening, everyone knew the outcome. The HOA had lost, Deborah had been embarrassed, and Michael's driveway was now more than just a symbol. It was a precedent. For the first time in months, Michael slept soundly. The fines, the threats, the endless tension, all of it felt distant now, replaced by relief. But victory has a strange way of unsettling those who can't accept defeat. The following morning, a new notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board. It wasn't signed by Deborah, but by another board member. It announced that Deborah had temporarily stepped down as president for personal reasons. Temporary. That was the word that caught Michael's attention, because deep down, he knew Deborah Keene wasn't the type to step down quietly forever. He had won the battle, yes, but somewhere behind closed doors, she was already plotting her next move. The days following the court victory were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. The cul-de-sac that once hummed with whispered gossip now buzzed with open conversations, quiet nods, and the unmistakable shift of loyalty. For years, Deborah Keene had ruled with a velvet fist, polite on the surface, iron underneath, but now, her authority had cracks wide enough for everyone to see. Michael didn't celebrate publicly. He didn't have to. The news traveled faster than any rumor Deborah had ever spread. Residents began stopping by his house, first cautiously, then with genuine gratitude. Some thanked him for standing up to the HOA. Others asked for advice about fences, flower beds, mailbox colors, all the little things Deborah had policed for years. It was as though one victory had given the entire community permission to breathe again. But Deborah wasn't gone. Not entirely. The notice about her temporary leave lingered on the community board, its edges curling under the morning dew. In her place, an interim president named Roger Dixon had been appointed, a mild-mannered retiree who had always seemed more interested in gardening than governance. His first act as interim president was to issue a short statement. The HOA will be reviewing its policies to ensure fairness and transparency moving forward. It sounded promising, but Michael had learned not to take words at face value. For a few weeks, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy calm. The patrols stopped. The fines slowed. The HOA emails softened in tone. For once, people were left alone to live their lives. But beneath that quiet, something was shifting. At night, Michael noticed a familiar SUV occasionally parked at the far end of the street, Deborah's black Range Rover. It would sit there for a while, engine off, lights dimmed, before disappearing again. He couldn't prove it was her, but the feeling of being watched never left. Then, slowly, new signs of control began creeping back in. Subtle at first, small reminders of the old regime. A community cleanliness initiative flyer appeared in mailboxes, encouraging homeowners to report unsightly modifications. Another memo warned that improper vehicle placement could still reflect poorly on community value. It didn't name Michael, but the implication was clear. Still, he refused to react. He had learned that the best revenge was composure. Instead, he focused on his home. The gravel driveway now gleamed with fresh stones, bordered by lush, low-maintenance plants. He even added motion lights and a sleek wooden privacy screen near the edge, not to hide, but to create a sense of peace. The transformation was beautiful, almost symbolic. What had begun as defiance now stood as a statement of pride. But then, something unexpected happened. One evening, Roger Dixon knocked on his door. The man looked nervous, his baseball cap clutched in both hands. He apologized for disturbing Michael and confessed that Deborah had been pressuring the board behind the scenes, emailing and calling almost daily, trying to influence decisions even after her leave. She had demanded that the HOA tighten control before the neighborhood's standards collapsed. Roger sighed, explaining that most of the board members were tired of it, tired of her. Some wanted her gone permanently, but didn't know how to make it official without community support. That's when Michael suggested something bold, a recall election. Under the HOA's own bylaws, residents could vote to remove a board member if enough signatures were gathered. It had never been done before, but it was possible. All it needed was momentum, and the community already had plenty of that. Word spread quickly. Michael didn't organize it directly. That would have made him an easy target, but others did. A quiet coalition of frustrated homeowners began circulating petitions, sharing stories of fines, warnings, and public embarrassment under Deborah's rule. Within 2 weeks, over half the neighborhood had signed. The HOA had no choice but to schedule a vote. It would be held in the community clubhouse, the same place where Deborah had once presided over every rule, every punishment, every smug declaration of power. The day of the vote arrived with a tension that hummed in the air. Cars lined the street, neighbors filing in one by one. For once, there was no nervous politeness. People spoke freely, exchanging knowing glances and quiet laughs. It was a reckoning years in the making. Deborah appeared near the start of the meeting, wearing her usual polished smile. If she was shaken, she hid it well. She made her case calmly, claiming she had always acted in the neighborhood's best interest and that her leadership had protected property values and order. But her words fell flat. The room was no longer hers. When Roger stood up to speak, his voice trembled but carried conviction. He spoke about fairness, about overreach, about how a community should be guided, not controlled. And then, to everyone's surprise, he cited Michael's case as the turning point. He called it the moment our neighborhood realized it could stand up for itself. That earned a quiet round of applause. When the votes were counted, the result was overwhelming. Deborah was officially removed from the HOA board. Effective immediately, she stood still for a long moment, eyes scanning the room as if waiting for someone, anyone, to stand with her. But no one did. Not this time. She gathered her folder, turned sharply, and left the room without a word. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of an era. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt lighter. People smiled more. Yards that had once been sterile under strict rules began showing small signs of individuality. Wind chimes, flower pots, colorful mailboxes. The place finally looked like people lived there, not like a catalog photo. Roger's first official act as president was to rewrite parts of the HOA charter. The new rules emphasized homeowner freedom and community collaboration. No more arbitrary fines. No more petty surveillance. Michael didn't attend the meetings, but he read every update with quiet satisfaction. It seemed like peace had finally arrived. But peace in an HOA community is rarely permanent. One chilly morning, about 3 weeks after Deborah's removal, Michael stepped outside to find an envelope tucked under his windshield wiper. No stamp, no return address, just his name written in sharp, familiar handwriting. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single line, written in neat cursive. You may have won the neighborhood, but this isn't over. No signature, no threat, just a promise. Michael stood there for a long moment, the paper fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was simply resolute. Deborah could plot, complain, or stew in bitterness all she wanted. He wasn't going anywhere. He'd already proven that strength wasn't about power. It was about standing firm when the odds were stacked against you. As he folded the note and walked back toward his house, a faint smile crossed his face. The gravel crunched beneath his feet, the same gravel that had started it all, and the sound felt like victory. Still, somewhere deep down, he knew the story wasn't completely finished. People like Deborah didn't fade quietly. They regrouped, rebuilt, and waited for their chance. And something in the crisp morning air told him that chance was coming. Weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood settled into a rhythm that almost felt normal. The HOA had evolved into what it was always meant to be, a body that helped rather than harassed. Neighbors spoke freely, decorations appeared on porches, and laughter occasionally echoed through the once silent cul-de-sac. Michael had become somewhat of a local legend, not by intention, but by persistence. The man who defied the HOA and won. The one who stood up to the untouchable Deborah Keene and forced her to face her own rules. But legends have a way of casting long shadows. Deborah disappeared from public view after her removal. Her Range Rover no longer prowled the streets, and her house remained eerily quiet. Some said she'd moved in with her sister out of town. Others whispered that she was preparing a lawsuit, though nothing official ever came of it. Michael didn't care much either way. He focused on his home, his work, and the little things that made the battle worthwhile. Evening drives, quiet mornings with coffee on his porch, and the sound of gravel crunching under his tires as he parked in the yard she once forbade. Then, one morning in late spring, a small white sign appeared near his property line. At first glance, It looked like any other HOA notice. But this one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a city development office. It stated that a code compliance inspection had been scheduled for his property due to potential unpermitted structural modifications. Michael stared at the notice for a long time. His driveway had been fully permitted and approved after his court case. There was no reason for a new inspection, unless someone had filed a complaint. Someone like Deborah. When the inspector arrived a few days later, Michael greeted him politely. The man seemed professional but uneasy, almost apologetic. He explained that an anonymous report had been filed alleging that Michael's driveway drainage was improperly graded, possibly diverting runoff toward neighboring properties. Michael knew that wasn't true. He had hired a certified contractor who ensured full compliance. Still, he cooperated fully, walking the inspector through every inch of the property, showing him documents, plans, and the original permit approval. After an hour, the inspector shook his head and smiled slightly. "Everything looks good. Someone's wasting both our time." Michael nodded. He didn't have to guess who. That night, he sat by his window, lights off, watching the street. Around midnight, he saw it again. The unmistakable glint of headlights stopping briefly near his house before slowly rolling away. A Range Rover. It wasn't paranoia anymore. She was back. Over the next few weeks, petty things began happening. Small, almost laughable at first. His mailbox was knocked over twice. Someone sprayed adhesive on his garbage bin lid. A faint smell of bleach near his flower beds one morning. Nothing provable. Nothing worth calling the police over. But the message was clear. Deborah was waging a quiet war of attrition. The strange part was the HOA didn't seem to know about it. Roger and the board were genuinely supportive, even offering to install a security camera near the entrance of the cul-de-sac. But Michael declined. He didn't want to turn his home into a fortress. He wanted to live. Still, he wasn't naive, so he took precautions. A few well-placed cameras around the yard, motion lights with backup power, and a small dash cam in his car, just in case. For a while, nothing happened. Then, one stormy night, the cameras caught movement. A figure, cloaked in a hooded rain jacket, creeping along the side of his property. The figure knelt briefly near the driveway, then hurried away when a flash of lightning illuminated the street. Michael reviewed the footage carefully. Even with the rain, he could see enough: the outline of a woman's frame, the posture, the cautious gait. He didn't need a face to know who it was. The next morning, he found what she'd been doing. A few small holes dug near the edge of the driveway, shallow but deliberate, enough to loosen the gravel and make it appear unstable. Petty, desperate sabotage. Michael didn't call her. He didn't confront her. He didn't even repair the holes right away. He knew the best way to end this wasn't through retaliation. It was through exposure. He compiled the footage, the timestamps, and the inspection notice, and sent everything to Roger and the HOA board. Within hours, Roger replied. He was furious, not just for Michael, but for what Deborah's actions represented. The board decided to act. 2 days later, a formal letter went out to all residents. It was titled Community Safety and Conduct Notice. It didn't name Deborah directly, but made it abundantly clear that harassment, vandalism, and intimidation of any homeowner would result in immediate legal action. The timing wasn't a coincidence. The letter arrived the same morning that a police cruiser quietly parked near Deborah's former home. Apparently, Roger had forwarded the footage to local authorities. Michael didn't ask for details, but a week later, the Range Rover was gone, this time for good. The house went up for sale shortly after, and within a month, a young couple with 2 kids moved in. The new owners introduced themselves with cookies and genuine smiles. The house that once symbolized fear now radiated something lighter: renewal. The driveway incident, the fines, the battles, the court, all of it felt like a lifetime ago. Yet every inch of gravel under Michael's tires told the same story. He had built his peace from defiance. The HOA transformed too. Under Roger's leadership, the board became open, communicative, even friendly. They hosted small community gatherings, barbecues, cleanups, and meetups that had nothing to do with rules. Just people being neighbors again. Sometimes, Michael would sit quietly and think about how all of it started. a simple parking dispute, a letter that told him what he couldn't do, and a stubborn streak that refused to bend. It was strange how one act of control had unraveled an entire system and rebuilt it stronger. Months later, on a warm evening, he stood at the end of his driveway, watching the sun set over the street. The light reflected off the gravel in soft gold tones, and he felt a quiet pride he couldn't quite put into words. This wasn't just a driveway anymore. It was a statement, a reminder that power isn't in titles, rules, or threats. It's in knowing where you stand and never letting anyone push you off that spot. As the streetlights flickered on, Michael turned toward his house, the sound of gravel crunching under his shoes. Behind him, laughter drifted from a nearby porch, the neighborhood alive again. No more fines, no more fear, just freedom. And as the wind rustled the trees, carrying the faint scent of fresh earth, it felt like the last trace of Deborah Keene had finally blown away for good.